Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. It seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ.
Let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels. The only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his travelling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul, which I find quite strange. So I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I do want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is completely intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of Doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is, the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of there's a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of two separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. But he talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of Doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this?
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
The earliest gospel we have, Mark, ends with no appearances of the risen Jesus, just women told he will be seen in Galilee, and they flee in fear, Mark 16:1-8. The later long ending with appearances, Mark 16:9-20, is a known later addition, not in our earliest manuscripts. Then, as time passes, later Gospels add fuller stories, Matthew and Luke, circa 80 to 90 CE, and finally John circa 90 to 110 CE, which is exactly the kind of legendary growth historians expect. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15, written in the 50s CE, says Jesus appeared to more than 500, but gives no names, place, or narrative, and no other source reports it. Paul also never met Jesus in life and says he received this tradition, so we can't treat it as checked eyewitness history, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. Claims that groups don't hallucinate, overlook what psychology shows. Grief and expectancy can produce vivid experiences. Studies find 30 to 60% of bereaved people report seeing or sensing a loved one. Memory conformity then spreads and reshapes stories. Even Acts' accounts of Paul's conversion show his companions didn't share his vision, Acts 9:7, 22:9, which matches an internal, personal experience. John's Doubting Thomas ends with, "Blessed are those who have not seen," John 20:29, and the author says he wrote so readers would believe, John 20:31. That's faith-forward theology, not verifiable history. On balance, the earliest evidence fits developing tradition and visionary experiences, not a confirmed physical resurrection.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of irrational in doing so.
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability.
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Wouldn't you say, like as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
you'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates its message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false Messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense.
Yeah.
I think that answers it quite well, I think.
Would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically?
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder, I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate a question. So it's my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask you
sure.
When it comes to you have anything else you want to say now.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly. Yeah,
so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah, so I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
When we ask how probable a miracle is, start with the base rate. Across billions of human deaths, there are no medically verified cases of a person dead for days returning to normal life. That makes the prior tiny. To overcome a tiny prior, you need multiple, independent, detailed sources written close to the event. Instead, we have anonymous Gospels decades later. Mark around 70 CE, Matthew Luke around 80 to 90, John around 90 to 110, and a brief list in Paul without names or locations. Low prior plus weak, late testimony. Low posterior probability. Appeals to prophecy don't fix this. The verses Christians cite aren't clear predictions of a Messiah rising on the third day. Psalm 16:10 is about David not being abandoned to Sheol. Hosea 6:2 speaks of Israel's restoration. Isaiah 53:10-11 concerns the servant's vindication, not an explicit personal resurrection. These are theological readings after the fact, not straightforward forecasts fulfilled by data. Paul's conversion also fits known visionary experiences. Acts gives inconsistent details about what his companions perceived. Acts 9, 7 verses. 22-9, which points to literary shaping, and his companions don't share the vision, consistent with an internal event.
That the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication, then that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a fourth, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down on into our records. But I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all, and there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? To the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap, unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What the end of Mark's gospel does say is that, there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest Gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest Gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these Gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
When Christians argue there are only three options, disciples lied, were mistaken, or were right, we can point out a fourth, that the stories themselves changed as they were written down. This happens all the time in history. Legends grow, details get reshaped, and later writers add material. We see that in the Gospels. Mark, our earliest source, ends with no appearances. Decades later, Matthew and Luke expand the story with appearances, and John, our latest source, adds even more dramatic scenes like doubting Thomas. The further from the events, the bigger the claims. And there are contradictions. Matthew places Jesus' appearance in Galilee, while Luke keeps it in Jerusalem. The number of women at the tomb, the number of angels, and what exactly happens at the tomb all change from gospel to gospel. This is what you expect if stories are developing, not if they're carefully preserved eyewitness reports. From a naturalistic view, ordinary errors, embellishments, and visions are far more likely than one man breaking the universal biological rule of death. If another religion today offered the same kind of evidence for a miracle, would Christians believe it? What do you think? Is the resurrection better explained by faith tradition than by history? Comment below. Let's discuss. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more.
You need to know. The classical, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction.
Because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
If people don't understand that so much of what they believe is actually a result of how integrating those beliefs makes you behave and makes you feel, if people think that they're acting purely rationally, that every single decision they make about their worldview and their opinions about the world are purely sort of analytical, syllogistic reasoning, then I think they're either telling the truth, in which case they're missing something incredibly important about the human experience, or they don't realize just how much their emotional states are creeping into their rational thought.
You are infamously began your career on the internet as a new atheist firebrand, kind of the youngest of the lot. And at the same time, you seem to have a almost religious fervor for the Bible and Christianity. What is it that obsesses you about the Bible and the Christian mythology?
The Christians will tell you it's the Christian equivalent of what the Muslims call fitra, the sort of inherent desire or drive that a person is born with towards God, and that I'm being sort of whispered to and through the scripture. I don't think it's that, partly because I'm so critical of the text. It is the only ancient text with which I have enough familiarity to talk about meaningfully. Some people get obsessed with the Odyssey or Metamorphosis or something. And I think part of the interest is, can we be sure that Homer wrote this? Can we figure out why? Can we figure out how people interpreted the story at the time? Did the Greeks really believe in the existence of their gods? These are interesting questions, but questions that I don't really have anything to say about because I don't know their stories very well. With the Bible, I spent so long in the new atheist school of thinking that religion is harmful and definitely untrue that I learned a thing or two about the Bible.
But even, I would say, more than that, you studied theology.
That's true.
So that's taking a big step other than becoming vaguely familiar with the Gospels.
But there's a level to which, when you are in the new atheist sort of firebrand spirit, you think, okay, I'm going to learn about this religion because I want to have better discussions and better debates. And then something shifts, and I'm like, look, it's so simplistic to say religion is bad. I think saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. Kind of makes sense, and you could make some case. You could give some grand speech saying politics, it drives families apart. And can you name one war that wasn't caused by politics? It's so terrible. And that's kind of true, but it seems trivially true. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a correct political position. And it doesn't mean that you should abstain from doing politics.
Or that humanity needs politics to a certain level, to a certain degree.
Exactly.
We have to govern and we have to find discourse and ways to legislate.
So I think it's pretty naive. And then I'm left in a position where I no longer think I can make this surface level simplistic firebrand atheist case, but I also am now just really interested in the Gospels. Because once you've spent so long learning about this kind of stuff, when somebody comes along and says, hey, have you ever noticed this about the text? It just is interesting to me because this is something that I've known about for years, and here's something new that I'm discovering. So I just fell into this, I don't know, the only way I can describe it is a bit like how people get interested in all kinds of texts. People have their favorite play or something like that.
I'm going to push back a little bit.
Sure.
I find that a little disingenuous that you're saying the reason I'm interested in the Gospels is it's the thing I'm the most familiar with. I could be familiar with the work of,
in fairness, there aren't like
Zarathustra or the Epic of Gilgamesh or something, but
there aren't world religions that have sprung up that are as relevant to the people I interact with today around something like the.
So there's a certain level of relevance to it as well,
because also I do philosophy more broadly. I talk about ethics. I talk about free will. I talk about all of this kind of stuff. And in doing that, people always come to the table with religion. It always comes up. You're talking about the big questions with people. Around half of them are probably going to be religious. And some of them are going to be Christian. And I just find these conversations so interesting.
It's fascinating talking about this with you. Really, I'm truly fascinated, and I love getting a non-Christian's perspective on the gospel, because I try and dive in occasionally on my own and understand it, and it's so difficult to separate it from canon.
And please take my words with a pinch of salt.
Sure.
Your listeners should, like, if I've said something that's an egregious error, don't blame Rain. I'm just a guy. I'm just an atheist.
We're having a conversation. What do I know? I'm just a stupid sitcom actor. But I did want to pick your brain about atheism. And I know right now I would call you kind of a spiritual atheist. Is such a thing possible? Can one be a spiritual atheist?
Sure.
How would that work?
I'm never quite sure what someone means by spiritual. Like, do you mean like has a spirit or believes that?
An atheist that incorporates kind of transcendent emotions into a larger kind of heart-based compassion.
I would say
into their belief structure and way of living.
I leave room for it. I don't believe in anything transcendent of the material, but I haven't like ruled it out, and I'm not a materialist in the sense of saying there is only the material.
Are you now considering yourself an agnostic?
Yeah, I think that's
is that a cop-out? A lot of people would say, like, Sebastian Junger came on the show and he's like, it's a bullshit cop-out. You're either an atheist or you're a theist. Of course there's an agnostic. We can't know anything. We can't know any truth. What do you think?
Cognitive science has shown for decades that belief isn't purely rational. Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2, thinking proves that most decisions start with fast, emotional instincts, and then we rationalize them afterward. Religious faith works the same way. It appeals to feelings of comfort and belonging. Neuroscience studies even show that prayer and worship activate the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine, which reinforces belief whether or not it's true. History backs this up too. Christianity itself absorbed myths and customs from earlier religions. Christmas falls near the Roman festival of Saturnalia, and the story of a dying and rising savior parallels older myths like Osiris and Mithras. Even within the Bible, contradictions reveal human authors, not divine truth. The Gospels can't agree on Jesus' genealogy, Matthew 1 versus Luke 3. Luke 3, or what happened at the resurrection. So Alex is right. Our worldviews aren't cold logic. They're shaped by emotional and cultural forces. That's why Christianity spread, not because it proved God exists, but because it resonated with human psychology and borrowed from traditions that came before. Once you see that, it's clear belief is about human needs, not divine truth.
Well, I've heard people say that, and usually it's an atheist of the type of Christopher Hitchens who wants to say that, agnostics are just atheists without a backbone or something. It's like, okay, man, I still don't know if God exists. Like, that is just true. I don't know. It would be maybe a cop-out if I was intentionally, like, calling myself one just for, like, better PR or something. But if anything, it has the opposite effect because I get a lot of flack for not being too, firm in a position. As I like to say, I will die on this fence. I think it is the most reasonable position to hold, especially because there are so many levels to agnosticism. It's like, okay, is it that you don't know? Is it that you think that it's unknowable? Because it could be that, like, I'm agnostic about whether it's raining outside, but I believe we could go and find out with a little bit of effort if it's raining outside. But there's a kind of agnosticism which says you can't know, right? So I could be an agnostic in the sense, like, my some random uncle of mine or something who's never really thought about theology would probably say, if I were to ask, like, yeah, I guess I'm an agnostic, I don't know. But that's just because, I haven't looked at the arguments. If I have a look, I'll figure it out. There are others who have studied all of the arguments, still say they're agnostic, but because they think you won't be able to get to an answer, right? And that's it's a difference saying, I just don't know and I can't know. But there's also an agnosticism that comes about as not knowing what someone's talking about. Do you believe in God? I was like, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by God? Really? It's that annoying Petersonian question, but you need to know. The classical, like, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction. But if you think that God is just being, then you could, as an atheist, be like, yeah, okay, well, I believe that stuff exists, and I guess that makes me a pantheist or something. And it all starts getting muddy and confused.
Sure.
So it's like, okay.
We talked about this before in the limitations of language.
Yeah, it's like ask me, like define the thing you want to know if I believe in, and ask me if I believe in it, and I will tell you to the best of my ability whether I can or I can't. But if somebody says that agnosticism is just a cop-out, well, I think that's a rhetorical cop-out. I think they're just sort of saying something that's a bit sort of spicy and fun and makes you sound like an edgy atheist, but is actually indicative of either not understanding or purposefully misrepresenting the position of the agnostic.
Now, you said before that you don't believe in anything beyond the material. And in our previous conversation, I described kind of my definition of God as being much more akin to something like beauty or truth or even love. Have you ever been in love?
Yeah.
You've been in love. You've felt deep love for a partner, a romantic partner?
Yeah.
And have you felt it for a family member?
Yeah. I mean, one always wants to say, I think so, because I imagine that, for example, when you have a child
I feel
for the first
so.
time, and
You-
yeah, that's
Okay.
the problem, isn't it?
Okay.
But I can kind
You
of imagine
think that you have felt love, but you don't know that you've felt it on the kind of a level of like having a child or something like
that's what I mean. It's like I'm sure that when you have a child, it
changes the paradigm.
I had
really
I had a
does.
Christian friend who recently had a child and said that having a child made them suddenly understand not the sacrifice of Jesus as sacrificing himself, but the sacrifice of the Father sacrificing his only son. He was like, I've just
Right.
unlocked this whole new understanding of what it means to love a son that you've
I had a
forgotten.
new understanding of God and the divine when I had a child. I didn't
Yeah.
have it. My wife had it, and my wife and my child almost died in childbirth. And
Yeah.
it was a horrific story. And it was in the middle of the night in a hallway in the emergency room in a hospital in Van Nuys, California. It was utter childbirth nightmare that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Everyone survived. It came out great. And I held my son in one of the most profound moments of my life in this hallway at 4 a.m., having him almost die and being brought back from death. And there I was, and I looked him in the eyes, and I felt a kind of love on a level that I had never experienced before. And it made me understand God in a different way, because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
Yeah.
Because when you love this child so much, of course there are consequences to behaviors. You know, when my son did some nefarious activities here and there in his teenage years, there were consequences to it, but the love never wavered. And the idea of some kind of like undying punishment from me to this beautiful little creature that had come into the world was beyond the possibility. And then I'm just a unemployed sitcom actor with a mediocre podcast. What do I know? Let alone the divine being, Father, creator of love itself. How much love, how much intimacy, closeness, and light does this, this essence hold us all? The idea of like some kind of punishment or smiting then just becomes ludicrous. So it did, for me, shift my my perspective of the divine. Does that make sense?
And there are things which experience gives you that you just can't quite put into words. I mean, William James famously tried to sort of analyze what religious experience is, and he comes up with these, I think there are like 4 qualities, and one of the qualities of religious experience is its ineffability, that you cannot put it into words, that you can't explain it. It's something that you literally just can't explain. It's like taking psychedelics, right? If you take psychedelics, and you try to explain what it's like, you can kind of get halfway there, but there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
I heard in an interview that you did, and I was listening to a clip of it, and you were talking about like, imagine someone trying to write an essay about the color blue.
Yeah.
You could know a little bit, it could give you some clues into the color blue. But if you'd never seen color before and you grew up in a gray room or you were colorblind or whatever, and all of a sudden you had access to color, seeing the color blue is a very different experience than reading about the color blue.
Yeah, this is a thought experiment called Mary's Room. So you imagine Mary in this room, but you can make it even worse because you can say, imagine that Mary in this black and white room that she's born in has access to everything that ever even could be written or uncovered or understood about the color blue. All the science that we yet to discover, all the color theory, everything that could even be known. She has it all written down, she studies it all. And then she steps outside and she sees something blue. The question is, does she learn something? And it seems like the answer is yes. And if that's the case, then there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
When Alex says he'll die on the fence as an agnostic, he's actually pointing to one of the strongest philosophical positions. We don't know, and maybe we can't know. Even Thomas Huxley, who coined the term agnostic in the 19th century, argued that intellectual honesty requires admitting limits to human knowledge. Science supports this. The Mary's Room thought experiment in philosophy of mind shows that no matter how much you know about an experience, you can't fully understand it without living it. That doesn't mean the supernatural is real. It just means human brains process knowledge differently when tied to emotion and perception. And religious experiences don't prove a God. Neuroscience shows that love, awe, and mystical states all arise from brain activity. Experiments with psychedelics like psilocybin reliably trigger feelings of unity, transcendence, or divine presence, the same sensations people attribute to God. In fact, Andrew Newberg's brain scans of praying nuns and meditating monks revealed predictable neurological patterns, not evidence of heaven. Even the Bible contradicts the idea of an all-loving God revealed through experience. Exodus 34:7 describes God punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Compare that to Jesus' teaching of unconditional forgiveness, and you see human authors projecting different experiences of love, fear, and control, not a consistent divine truth.
When that is best.
And love is like that.
And that points us to love, because I think that love is the greatest kind of analogy to God. And you said, I don't believe in anything kind of transcendent beyond the material. Do you believe that love is merely kind of neurons and endorphins in the brain, united with some kind of DNA kind of like impetus towards propagation of the species?
Now, that's a genuine mystery, because I think that's tied up to the question of consciousness more broadly. I don't have any problem saying that the experience of love is something like a feeling. It's something that you very strongly feel. And so if you're going to be a materialist about consciousness in general, you can say that love is just one of those feelings that is neurons in the brain. But not specific to love, just specific to feeling anything. I find it very strange to say that not that the feeling of love or the seeing of blue is correlated with brain activity, but that is the brain activity. That love is the same thing as the neurons firing in my brain when I feel love. I'm not interested in what the brain's doing. I'm interested in the experience that correlates with that brain activity. You know, if the experience of seeing blue is just neurons firing in my brain, if that's what blue is, I should be able to cut open your brain and find blue in there somewhere, but you can't. There's something called blue, this experience that you have, which goes alongside the brain activity, but is not the same thing as it. That is the greatest mystery for materialists to explain, which is why I'm agnostic. That's why I say I leave room for this. I don't say I'm a materialist. The biggest challenge for that is consciousness.
Well, one of the biggest disservices that atheists, I feel, do to themselves and to their cause, because atheists can be extremely evangelical, is this idea that consciousness is an illusion. You know, it's the Daniel Dennett kind of thing. Like we're getting all of these inputs, and our brain makes them become a totality of experience, but it's all illusory, including emotion. And that free will is also an illusion, but that, you know, between our DNA and between our neurons firing and our background and our B.F. Skinner kind of behavioralist way that we've grown up in our culture, you know, any choice that we're seeming to make has actually been pre-wired into our cognition. But if atheists hold to consciousness is an illusion and there's no such thing as free will, you're not going to gain a lot of converts. Because if you go to a random house over here in Thousand Oaks, California,
have you heard the bad news?
Like, hey, by the way, guys, your experience of being a human being, memories and growing up and falling in love and breaking your leg and losing your uncle and seeing the Mona Lisa for the first time. By the way, that's all an illusion.
Yeah.
And in fact, you didn't even really experience that. And you didn't even choose to go to Italy and go see the Mona Lisa. That was all chosen for you in a variety of different ways. You're not really doing yourselves any favor by gaining people over to the atheist bandwagon.
The few issues I'd have to raise to that, though, are firstly that truth doesn't have to be palatable, right? If it is actually the case, you might not have many converts to it, but if it is the case, then it just is the case. Also, some people will say that
Christians would say the same thing.
That's true, but that's the thing.
Burning in hell may not be palatable,
but it
doesn't convert
hear,
people,
right? Exactly.
But it's true.
And so I think, the kind of atheist materialists you're talking about would say the same thing. Technically speaking, you don't have to be a materialist to be an atheist, because atheism is being without God.
Yep.
You could believe that there's an immaterial existence. You could believe in mind-body dualism, but not believe that there's a God, for example. That's another important thing to spell out. But yeah, I mean, the idea that consciousness is an illusion, I think, is pretty confused. Having said that, I haven't thought about this as much as Daniel Dennett has, so I have to temper my words. But I really think that that's almost a contradiction in terms. There's also another sort of element that's missing from this picture. We talk about there only being the material, or there being the material, but also this like mind stuff, this immaterial thing. There's also a position that there's only the mind stuff and that the material doesn't exist.
Oh, that's good. I know my friend Stephen Phelps is out there watching, and he's all in favor of that.
Yeah.
Right? You lit up like a Christmas tree. He's so happy right now.
So they call it idealism, at least in one of its forms.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that.
So it's kind of mysterious how materialists account for consciousness, but they say, like, in some way, the conscious experience is just emergent of material properties. And the idealist says that the material world is emergent of a mind. So George Berkeley is sort of the classic philosopher to think about here. He starts by sort of asking the reader to be like, it's impossible to separate the thing from your idea of the thing, right? Like if you try to imagine a tree that's just on its own somewhere in a forest, you've got the concept in your mind. The thing that's in your mind is the concept of the tree. It's not you don't have a material tree in your mind. It's the concept. And like your sense experience, you're only seeing a representation of what's in front of you.
Is that kind of like Plato's forms, like the ideal form?
Plato is sort of abstracting from objects to understand why this is a cup and that's also a cup. What is it they have in common? They're far apart from each other. They're different colors. They're different shapes. What is it they have in common? Well, they both share in this abstract thing called a form. That's a whole other thing, which I also think kind of maybe points to consciousness, but that's really interesting. But no, Berkeley is talking about you can't think of a thing without thinking of the thing, right? Nothing exists except insofar as it's being thought about. Now, I think there are so many holes to poke in this, but this is Berkeley's position. So he's like, when you see a table, you're just seeing your mind's representation of the table. You don't see the table directly. Same thing like Kant points out, you don't have direct access to the table. It's through your experience. Okay, well, the same thing with anything, and the critic says, well, I can conceive of a cup just existing on its own. And Berkeley's like, yeah, but you're conceiving of it. And so what you're imagining is a thought. So here comes the objection to this position. Aha, okay, well, Mr. Berkeley, if I have a candle and I light the candle and I look at it and then I leave the room and I don't think about it, no one's thinking about the candle, and yet I come back and the candle has melted. There must have been a time in between where the candle existed, but no one was thinking about it. So it existed separate from thought. And Berkeley says, I still think that things only exist insofar as they're being thought about. But what you've just proven is that there is always some kind of mind thinking about everything all at once.
Ooh.
And that's what God is for George Berkeley.
Interesting.
So Berkeley thinks that God exists and the entire material universe is like a thought of God, which is kind of interesting. The Plato's form thing is interesting because there is this great mystery. Why is this a cup? Why is that a cup? Why is this a table and this not a table? It's actually a really difficult question to answer.
When people say love proves God, they're confusing emotion with evidence. Neuroscience is clear. Love is a product of brain chemistry. Oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin drive bonding between partners, parents, and children. These chemicals evolved to help humans survive and pass on their genes, not to reveal the divine. The fact that we feel love so powerfully doesn't mean it comes from outside the material. It means our brains are wired for it. Consciousness is often called the hard problem, but that mystery doesn't point to God either. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland argue that consciousness emerges from complex neural networks, just like flight emerges from wings. We don't need a supernatural soul to explain experience. And history shows that claims about consciousness as proof of God shift with time. Augustine said it was the soul. Descartes said it was dualism. Today, neuroscience shows its electrochemical activity. Each step shrinks the role of God. Even Berkeley's idea that the universe only exists because God is thinking it falls apart. Physics shows the universe operated for billions of years before humans, or any minds, were here to perceive it. Cosmic background radiation, fossil records, and planetary evolution all prove that matter existed long before thought. So love, consciousness, and philosophy don't point to God. They point to the complexity of the human brain. The beauty of agnosticism and atheism is that it allows us to admit what we don't yet know without inventing a supernatural answer. What do you think? Does love prove God? Or is it just chemistry and evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this gave you perspective, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into philosophy, science, and belief.
It's a bit weird. Like, how is Yahweh the only God? Like, presiding over a council of gods. That doesn't make any sense. And then later in the psalm it says, I have said that you are gods. You shall be sons of the Most High. So in the psalm, what's clearly happening here is the word gods here, and some translation puts it in scare quotes. The word God here doesn't mean God as in like Yahweh. It means God as in like a divine member of this council, right? And God clarifies, the psalmist clarifies in Psalm 82, he says, I shall call you gods. You shall be called gods, sons of the Most High. So clarifying that what I mean is that you are not the Most High, you are sons of the Most High. In fact, there's one point in the Gospels, it's the only time this happens, where Jesus is explicitly accused of claiming to be God. It happens, they say, you're claiming to be God. And Jesus downplays it. It's semi-complicated in that there's a psalm in the Old Testament. This is Psalm 82, which opens by saying that Yahweh presides among the council of the gods. Elohim, gods. It's a bit weird. Like, how is Yahweh the only God? Like, presiding over a council of gods. That doesn't make any sense. And then later in the psalm it says, I have said that you are gods. You shall be sons of the Most High. So in the psalm, what's clearly happening here is the word gods here, and some translation puts it in scare quotes. The word God here doesn't mean God as in like Yahweh. It means God as in like a divine member of this council, right? And God clarifies, the psalmist clarifies in Psalm 82, he says, I shall call you gods. You shall be called gods, sons of the Most High. So clarifying that what I mean is that you are not the Most High, you are sons of the Most High, right? Okay, park that. And bear in mind that most Jews are familiar with Jewish scripture, right? Jesus is talking to his Jewish opponents. And this time, he says, I and the Father are one. Because they're asking about his identity. They say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And he says, I and the Father are one. And the Jewish opponents say to him, they pick up stones again. They go to stone him to death. And he goes like, I'm just telling you the works of my Father. What are you stoning me for? I've been telling you things of my Father. For which of those do you stone me? And they say, we're not stoning you for any good works. We're stoning you because you, a mere human, claim to be God. So they accuse him. Here it is, the most dramatic, most important moment of the Gospels for Christology. You're claiming to be God. What does Jesus say? Does he go, yeah, you're right? No, he says to them, have you not read your scriptures? Is it not written that you shall become gods, or you shall be called gods? So he quotes the psalm that I've just mentioned, which expressly calls non-gods, like non-Yahweh beings, gods. And when asked about his identity, he chooses to quote that psalm. And he says to them, is it not written, you shall be called gods? If God was willing to give those people that title, and the scripture can't be set aside, then why wouldn't he give that title to me? He then says, so why are you then accusing me of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God? So he clarifies. They say, you're claiming to be God. And he says, have you not read your scriptures? This is just a title that was given to the divine council. If he'd give it to them, why wouldn't he give it to me? Why are you accusing me of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God? Because they're the sons of the Most High. And so the one point where Jesus is explicitly accused of claiming to be God, in my view, he
goes, I'm not.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
I think he's saying he's not. So Christians, again, will interpret this and say, like, okay, he's answering in a very clever way, which sort of doesn't deny his divinity.
Saying we all are.
But no, well, they don't want to say that we're all divine. They want to say that he is claiming to be God here, but he's doing it. He's probably answering in this way because he's being intentionally unclear, because it's not his time to die yet. Whatever.
When Jesus is accused of making himself God in John 10, his response actually undercuts the idea that he's divine. He cites Psalm 82:6. I said, "You are gods, sons of the Most High." In Jewish thought, this didn't mean Yahweh was calling them literal gods. Most scholars agree it was a metaphor for Israel's judges, or divine council members who carried out God's justice. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect this same Second Temple Jewish idea that gods could mean heavenly beings under God's authority, not Yahweh himself. If Jesus had wanted to affirm that he was God, this would have been the perfect time. Instead, he points to Scripture where others, not divine, were called gods. That's a downplaying, not an elevation. The earliest Christians didn't even see Jesus as God. Paul's letters, which are the oldest writings in the New Testament, around 50 CE, never called Jesus God. Instead, Paul calls him the mediator between God and mankind. 1 Timothy 2:5. Historically, the belief that Jesus was fully God only became official doctrine centuries later at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Before that, Christian groups debated whether Jesus was divine, semi-divine, or just an exalted human. That proves the text of John 10 can't be read as a clear divine claim. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been centuries of argument about it. From a Jewish perspective, too, the idea that a man could be Yahweh was blasphemous. The Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, is the core of Jewish belief. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Jesus never overturns that. In fact, when asked the greatest commandment, Mark 12:29, he repeats the Shema, affirming strict monotheism.
Their argument too. I think it's a really clever argument, because he's basically going, you can't say that I'm blaspheming if I am upholding Scripture, right? So if you're going to kill me for that, and you're going to uphold your law, point out in the book where I'm blaspheming.
And the key thing to notice is that, like, in this case, they pick up stones to stone him, and he goes like, "Why are you accusing me of blasphemy? I'm not doing what you think I'm doing." And so when it comes to chapter 8, when it comes to John chapter 8, and Christians often say, "Well, why would they like throw stones at him and try to kill him if he wasn't claiming to be God?" It's like, well, because somewhere else in the Gospels they tried to stone him for claiming to be God, and they were wrong. So I don't think that they got it right, you know?
And what about the worship of Christ? Like the people at the time worshiping him?
This is another big thing, like worship. Worship is something that's only given to God. In fact, when in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, Jesus is in the desert being tempted by Satan, and Satan says, "If you just bow down and worship me, I will give you all of this land." And Jesus says, "Worship God and serve him only." And yet, throughout the Gospels, Jesus is worshipped, and he accepts worship. So he must be God, right? A few things to note. First, how many times the first important thing to note is what the word worship means. It's difficult to define even in English, but in Greek there are two words that are typically translated as worship in the New Testament. One is proskuneo, and one is latruo. Proskuneo just means to sort of bow down or prostrate yourself before a higher authority. Latruo tends to refer to like cultic religious worship of the kind that you might give to God. In no instance is latruo worship given to Jesus in the Gospels. There is arguably an ambiguous case in Revelation.
This all ties together so beautifully. So we're going to get here in a second. But first, as a critical stepping stone, let's look at what he mentions here from Revelation, because it actually directly ties in.
It's a bit unclear. What happens is you've got the Lamb who sort of sits on or in the center of or nearby the throne. So there's the throne of God and there's this throne of the Lamb. And it's not entirely clear what the organizational structure is. So there's like the throne of God, and then the Lamb is like either on the throne or in the middle of the throne. And then it says that latruo worship was given to him. So the only two times it occurs is when we're talking about the Almighty God, the Father, and Jesus, and they're sort of together in a very ambiguous sense, and then it always uses the singular pronoun of him. It never says them, it always says him. So those instances of latruo, I think it's defensible that the person actually being worshipped there is God the Father, is the Almighty God. But it does seem a little bit weird that Jesus, or the Lamb, is like on the throne or near the throne. So maybe Jesus is being given latruo there, but it seems weird that it would say that they worshipped him rather than they worshipped then. You've got God and the Son, and they worshipped him.
Christians point out that Jesus was worshipped. They often miss the nuance in the Greek. In the Gospels, the word used is proskuneo, which simply means bowing or showing reverence to a higher authority. It's the same word used when people bowed to kings or prophets, not evidence they were considered God. The stronger word latrio, meaning sacred service owed only to God, is never applied to Jesus in the Gospels. This distinction explains why his opponents accused him of blasphemy but were mistaken. In John 10, he corrects them by pointing to Scripture. And when Christians later insist that his acceptance of worship proves divinity, that overlooks how Jews at the time understood reverence. Bowing to someone didn't make them Yahweh. Even Revelation, which seems to blur the line, is ambiguous. The singular pronoun in Revelation 22:3, they will serve him, points most naturally to God on the throne, not Jesus. The fact that the early church spent centuries arguing over whether Jesus was divine shows this wasn't obvious from the texts themselves.
But it does seem a little bit weird that Jesus, or the Lamb, is like on the throne or near the throne. So maybe Jesus is being given latruo there, but it seems weird that it would say that they worshipped him rather than they worshipped then. You've got God and the Son, and they worshipped him.
But never in the four Gospels was...
Never in the Gospels is latruo worship given to Jesus.
This idea of Jesus being...
Not once. Isn't that fun? Isn't that cool? Does not happen at all. The key text here, by the way, is "Did the early Christians worship Jesus?" by
It's fun
James
for you.
Dunn.
Look at Mark's face. He's having a
He's melting. I sweat over it. Is this interpretation that you have of Jesus similar to the Muslim interpretation of Jesus?
It is in the sense of not thinking he claimed to be God. So yeah, this is an interesting thing. So Muslims don't believe that Jesus died on a cross. They don't believe that he was God. They don't believe he claimed to be God. They believe he was a prophet. And so they take a lot of the same lines I do here. But of course, they're motivated for different reasons. Of course. I'm just interested in the historical figure of Jesus. But yeah, a lot of these arguments, like if you... And the annoying thing is that a lot of the time, this debate only seems to happen in the context of Christians versus Muslims, because atheists don't care. Who cares? Right. Oh, Jesus said, "Oh, I in the Father," and whatever, man. Like who cares? I'm going to go eat lunch. You know? But I'm interested. But it means that, like, when Christians are debating with Muslims, so for example, when Jesus says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, I'm the first and the last," you know, a Christian could say, "But in the Quran, that's a title that God gives to himself." You know, in the Quran...
so they're using Scripture
one of the names of God in the Quran is Al-Haq, which means the truth. I am the truth. And Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
Right.
And so if your God says that the truth is one of his titles, here's Jesus claiming to be God, right? So they have these kinds of debates. That doesn't do anything for me.
Right.
So when Muslims are on the offensive on this point, they will use some of the same arguments. They will point out that, like... Firstly, they'll be suspicious of John's historicity. They'll point out that when he says, "I and the Father are one," he seems to be saying that we can all be one all together.
Is it possible that the early language of Christ had different, like, oral tradition, that then when it was translated into Greek, some of those things got lost?
Yeah, so that's really important too, is that Jesus spoke Aramaic. So this is something that I always find incredibly interesting when people are really hanging on every word that Jesus said. Okay, you guys are listening very carefully to what I'm saying, right? You paying attention?
Yeah.
Can any of you...
No.
recite,
No.
excluding this one, the last sentence I just said? Just tell me the last sentence.
I'm still trying to pronounce Latruno, that depression medication you were telling us about. Yeah, okay, wow. So
side effects include visions of God.
Yeah. So, okay, wow, yes. So obviously there's going to be some...
You can't remember the words that I said to you 20 seconds ago, but I'm expected to believe that the New Testament authors who were writing, at best, decades after the death of Jesus, could remember his exact words and write them down accurately in a language that he wasn't speaking.
In a language that he wasn't speaking is
no way, man. Now, what's important to note there, though, is that, like, if I said something really particular, like if I were talking to you and then I suddenly said, you know, I'm a famous songwriter or something, that might stick in your memory such that in like a month or two you could remember that I said that because it was important. So if Jesus said before Abraham was I am, that's the kind of thing that people could remember.
This is my body.
Exactly. But like the I am thing, like, oh well, he was quoting the Old Testament. Okay, so we've got a Greek rendition. Well, actually, when we say it in English, we're using an English translation of a Greek text, quoting an Aramaic-speaking man, allegedly quoting a Hebrew scripture.
Yeah.
There are a lot of chains of transmission that we have to investigate and see what's.
And I might have misunderstood you, but 40 years later, at the earliest, I don't.
Is when it's written down.
If I'm quoting something you said last week, I don't know.
Yeah. Some people think that John's Gospel is earlier. So John's Gospel tends to be dated to 90 to 100 AD. Some people date it earlier because there's one verse in John's Gospel, John chapter 5. It opens up by saying, now there is a pool by the sheep's gate. And it says, at this pool, this is what happened. But John says there is a pool. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And so if John's writing his gospel, and this isn't like Jesus...
He's writing it in real time.
He says, now there is a sheep's gate near the pool. If that sheep gate had been destroyed, then why would he have written it like that? So some people, for that reason, put John pre-70. Kind of interesting, but the important thing to note is that it's all speculative. But at the very least, we're talking. That's why I say at best, decades after. Some
why
scholars
did they
have
wait decades after to write it?
That's a good question. I mean, why were the Gospels written in the first place, right? Like Jesus is going around saying his stuff, and he's got disciples and stuff, and there are different philosophies on this. One is that some people think that Mark's Gospel, which is the first one, was written in order to deal with the destruction of the temple. The temple is the most important site for Jews, even today, right? But the temple at the time, like part of being a Jew involved like practices that you have to do at the temple. So for them, this is like God's house. This is where it happens. And so when that temple is destroyed, what do you do?
Yeah.
How are you going to interpret this? And in many respects, Jesus is presenting himself as the new temple, And so some people think that Mark's Gospel is written as a sort of way to respond to the temple's destruction, because he talks about the temple being destroyed a fair bit.
Going back, what is it, 60 years? What was happening at the time that allowed John the Baptist to rise in popularity? Like, what was happening culturally? Is there any conversation about that? Why, like, forgiveness could have been so important?
Well, forgiveness has always been important in religious traditions, but it's seen as the prerogative of God.
Right.
And so it's unlikely that the Christians won't think that John the Baptist was actually forgiving sins. They will think that he was like announcing the forgiveness of sins or helping people participate in a ritual whereby God would forgive them.
But why was this so popular then? Were there other people throughout history at that time that were also implementing this? Like, what was the societal utility that made him rise to superstardom? As you said, everybody from Judea is going there.
We don't know, because we don't have a lot of details about John the Baptist in particular. But we know
fascinating from what you're telling me right now.
He's my favorite character.
Yeah, why is there so... I mean, obviously you're right next to the J-Man, so it's going to be tough to live in that shadow. But to me, you start something that seems to be a break off from Judaism. I don't know how many other of these religions are existing at the time, but he seems to be the one that's the most popular. And then his disciple becomes God. So what is happening with him?
I'm fascinated by him. And the thing is, we just don't have very much information at all, because the Gospels are so dense and there is so much in them. You'd be amazed at some of the things that you can pull out, and things that people are still noticing today that they haven't noticed before about the Gospels. And yet, for some of our most famous figures, like John the Baptist or like Mary Magdalene, these people are like hardly mentioned. We have like no information about them. We don't know where they get their names. We don't know why she's called Mary Magdalene. Was there a place called Magdalene? Maybe. There's a place called Magdalene like in Israel, but it's unclear whether there's a connection there. Judas Iscariot. Why is he called Judas Iscariot? No one knows. There are theories about this. It could be because he was a member of a particular sect that used to murder Roman officials with a dagger, and the word for dagger is something like Icarii or something, and there was a group of people called the Icarii. And maybe Iscariot kind of sounds like that.
But this is very derivative.
No one knows. John the Baptist is someone that we just don't have that much information about.
And John the Baptist was residing in the woods around Nazareth?
In the wilderness, yeah.
But around Nazareth?
Around like Jerusalem, I think.
So then how does Jesus even come to...
Another key point is that nowhere in the four Gospels do we see Jesus receiving the kind of worship reserved only for God. That's consistent with the historical evidence. The earliest Christians didn't see him as Yahweh. but as a prophet or chosen figure. In fact, this lines up closely with the Muslim understanding of Jesus. Not God, not claiming to be God, but a messenger. The difference is that Muslims deny the crucifixion, while historians see it as one of the few facts about Jesus that's widely accepted. But both agree that he never claimed divinity. We also have to remember the problem of transmission. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but the Gospels were written decades later in Greek, sometimes quoting the Hebrew Bible, and what we read today is an English translation of that. That's several layers of language and memory between Jesus' words and what ended up on the page. Scholars remind us that memory itself is fragile. Even in a conversation, we can't perfectly recall what someone said 30 seconds ago. Expecting exact word-for-word accuracy decades later stretches credibility. On top of that, the Gospels weren't neutral history books. Mark, the earliest Gospel, was likely written after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. For Jews, the temple was God's dwelling place. Once it was destroyed, followers of Jesus had to reframe their faith. That context helps explain why the Gospels elevate Jesus' role so strongly. Not because he claimed to be God, but because the writers were responding to a crisis and shaping a new theology. So when we look closely at the texts, the languages, and the history, the evidence shows Jesus never clearly claimed to be God. The idea that he was divine was a later development, not something he himself taught. So here's the question. If Jesus never actually claimed to be God, what does that mean for the foundations of Christianity today? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into these kinds of debates.